Did you know that Professor Trelawney saw more than just a grim inside Harry's teacup? Or that Buckbeak wasn't the only hippogriff on display during Hagrid's first lesson? Or that the trio made a trip to a drunk Hagrid inside of his hut after his botched class? Well, if you didn't know any of those things, then you won't want to miss out on today's video as we unpack everything the movie missed about Harry's first couple classes in The Prisoner of Azkaban. These crucial moments reveal Harry's ominous death omen, introduce us to one of the most iconic characters in a painting at Hogwarts, and show us how Draco really got injured by Buckbeak. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 34 of Movies vs. Manuscripts, Harry Potter Edition. This is the show where I analyze the Harry Potter movies scene by scene and compare them to the books to find all the differences. Before we get into the analysis, I just wanted to give a shout out to this commenter from a previous episode. Each week, I highlight one of the top comments from a past video, so be sure to share your thoughts down below when you're done watching. Per usual, I'll cover all the changes across the four major categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But first, let's recap what happened during these scenes in the movie. Picking up with where we left off last week, we see Harry and Ron in Divination class as Professor Trelawney introduces herself. As she is speaking, Hermione shows up suddenly to the surprise of the boys, but they are quickly drawn back to Trelawney, who comes up to Ron and asks him to read the tea leaves in Harry's cup. After telling Harry that he will suffer but be happy about it, Trelawney grabs the cup and then quickly drops it with a gasp as she tells Harry that he has the Grim. Another Gryffindor boy then reads off what the Grim is and says that it's a death omen, and we're left on this ominous image of a dog in the bottom of Harry's teacup as the movie cuts to the next scene. We then see Ron, Harry, and Hermione walking down a path to Hagrid's hut as he then takes the students to their first Care of Magical Creatures class. Hagrid instructs them on how to open their books and then tells them a little bit about hippogriffs after revealing Buckbeak. Harry then unintentionally volunteers to go up to Buckbeak first, and Hagrid tells him how to bow. After a bit, Buckbeak bows back, and Harry goes up to pet him, and then eventually rides him. After landing back with the class, Harry gets off of Buckbeak, and Draco approaches, trying to show that what Harry did isn't actually hard at all. But in the process, Draco insults Buckbeak and gets slashed on the arm. Hagrid then picks up Draco and carries him away to the hospital wing, and that is where we're stopping our scenes for this week. As always, let's kick things off by going over our first three categories of characters, timeline, and location. Then once those are complete, we'll head into the all-important plot changes. First, for characters, we're missing Professor McGonagall, Fred and George Weasley, and Sir Cadogan. Sir Cadogan is a very interesting character who will have a presence throughout the rest of this book and year at Hogwarts, but I'll leave the details of his involvement for the plot changes. As for characters who we see but who are changed from their original book version, we have Lavender Brown and Parvati Patil, who both have more involved roles in the book, specifically regarding divination. Also, Pansy Parkinson is almost like Draco's girlfriend in the book and talks a little more than what we get in the movie. Next, for timeline, everything lines up to the book, except for the fact that the movie cut out their Transfiguration class and a couple of meals. That being said, that means for location, we're missing the Transfiguration classroom and the Great Hall. Other than that though, our timeline and location categories are pretty on point for this week. Now before I dive into the plot changes, I just want to remind you that I can't go line by line comparing word changes because that would take forever. Instead, I highly recommend you check out the audiobooks on Audible if you're interested in reliving the wizarding world for yourself firsthand. You can claim your free trial of Audible using my link in the description, which gets you one free audiobook of your choice and supports the channel at the same time. Now with that being said, let's get into the plot changes. To start things off for this week, we of course have an omitted section at the beginning of the chapter. Per usual, the movie cuts straight to the meat of the story and skips over any contextual or world-building moments that J.K. Rowling added to the start of each chapter in the book. For this chapter, which is titled Talons and Tea Leaves, Rowling starts off by filling us in on Harry's morning in the Great Hall having breakfast. And there are three details from this time that I want to cover. First, Draco and his goons were teasing Harry at breakfast. Of course, the night before, Harry had had his run-in with a Dementor on the train, and Draco was still riding that high. In the movie, we see Draco during the Care of Magical Creatures class making fun of Harry about a Dementor and pretending like one is there behind him. But in the book, it's actually during breakfast that the Slytherins, specifically Pansy Parkinson, shout at Harry and tell him that the Dementors are coming. A funny detail though is that Fred and George approach the trio at breakfast and then tell them that Draco wasn't so tough last night, as he came running into Fred and George's compartment to hide. The second moment from this breakfast scene in the book is really short, but a key detail to know. and it's that Fred mentions that they're playing Slytherin their first Quidditch match. Now, if you remember from the movie, Gryffindor actually plays Hufflepuff, and spoiler alert, the reason this happens is because Draco uses his injury from Buckbeak as an excuse to have Slytherin postpone their game. Really, he wasn't that hurt, but it threw Gryffindor off their game, as we'll learn in a future episode. Lastly, the third detail from this omitted breakfast moment is Ron noticing Hermione's class schedule, which they received that morning. As Ron looked over the schedule, he saw that Hermione had 3 classes booked at one time, but she of course told him that he was being silly because no one could be in 3 places at once. Part of this conversation is used for after the Divination class as the trio walks to Hagrid's, but they also combined it with some lines from their lunchtime, which we'll cover later. And now that we've covered breakfast, we can move on to Divination. But our first change here isn't inside the classroom, it actually has to do with their journey to the classroom. In the movie, they just cut straight to Harry and Ron in class, but the book describes their journey from the Great Hall to this odd room which is located in the North Tower, a very secluded location which is hard to find in the castle. And this is where we get introduced to Sir Cadogan, one of the most iconic paintings in Hogwarts. Here's what happens in the book. As the trio walked through the castle and up half a dozen staircases to get to nowhere, they realized that they were lost. Eventually, the landing they came to after their 7th staircase had a painting on the wall which showed a bare stretch of grass. As Ron and Hermione discussed which way they should go next, Harry looked at the painting and saw a pony walk into the portrait and munch on some grass, while a knight clambered into view looking like he had just fallen off of that pony. The knight spotted Harry and his friends and immediately shouted at them, "What villains are these that trespass upon my land?" But after brandishing his sword, which was too heavy for him and caused him to fall over, Harry asked him if he was alright. The knight was still on guard and tried to yank his sword out of the ground, but couldn't, and after watching him some more, Harry finally asked him where the North Tower was. And the knight immediately perked up and said, "A quest," and then told him to follow him. They quickly ran after this knight as he climbed through paintings on the wall to lead them to the tower, which they eventually found thanks to him. Upon their arrival, the intriguing character told them that if they were ever in need again, to call Sir Cadogan, and then he ran off. At this, Ron said, "Yeah, we'll call you if we ever need someone mental," but the knight was out of earshot. Now the trio faced another problem, along with their fellow Gryffindors who stood there as well. They looked up and saw a trapdoor above them, which read Sybil Trelawney, Divination teacher, and that was the only door in sight. Harry asked how they were supposed to get up there, and as if it heard him, the trapdoor opened and a ladder shot down. And then he and the rest of his classmates climbed up into the one-of-a-kind room that is Trelawney's class. Now, before we get to the class itself, there is one super small change that you might have noticed, which is that Hermione has been with them this whole time. Obviously, I think Hermione would have been smart enough to use the time turner properly, and her sudden appearance in the movie is a good clue to viewers, but it's not really realistic. The boys had no reason to wonder about her multiple classes because from what they could see, she was with them ever since breakfast. Now that being said, we can dive into the class itself and see just how accurate Professor Trelawney is in the movie. For the most part, I think they nailed her actual character, but in an effort to keep things within a certain time frame, they removed some of her antics. The movie still included her warning to Neville about his grandma, but in the book, she does much more than that. In fact, she makes many predictions. During her introductory speech, she would randomly break off mid-sentence and predict something about one of the students or the whole class in general. She tells Parvati Patel to beware of a red-haired man, to which Parvati looked back at Ron, who was behind her. Then she told Lavender Brown that the thing she was dreading will happen on the 16th of October. She also predicts that in February they will miss classes because of the flu, and that around Easter, one of their number will leave them forever. She also predicts Neville's clumsiness as they begin to read tea leaves by telling him to select one of the blue teacups after he has broken his first one. And sure enough, just moments later, Harry heard the tinkling of shattered glass as Neville broke his first cup. Now, these predictions are mostly funny, but most of them will actually come into play later in the story, so tuck them away for later. The next change we have with this class is that Harry is actually the one who reads Ron's cup first, and he is the one who says Ron will suffer but be happy about it. It is after this prediction from Harry that Ron goes next, saying that he sees an acorn or a blob in Harry's cup, which could mean that Harry will come into a lot of money soon, and then he has trouble distinguishing the other object in Harry's cup. Trelawney, who had been watching them, then came over and looked into the cup herself, and she saw not the Grim? That's right, she didn't actually see the Grim first. The first thing Trelawney sees is a falcon, which she says means Harry has a mortal enemy. At this, Hermione finally spoke up after being frustrated this whole time and said that everyone knows Harry has an enemy, Voldemort, obviously. Then Trelawney continues and says she sees a club, which means there will be an attack. Then she sees a skull, which means there's danger in Harry's path. And finally, on the last turn of the cup, she sees the Grim. Everyone in the class freaks out except the Muggleborns who don't know what it means, and Trelawney ends the class there. And that takes us into our next omitted moment, which is Transfiguration. This is a key part of the chapter because it allows McGonagall to clear some things up about Trelawney's predictions. We read that Harry sat at the back of the class to avoid being seen, but all his classmates still kept glancing at him as if he were going to drop dead right then and there. He had barely heard what McGonagall was teaching, but we learn in the book that she was talking about animagi. As we know, Professor McGonagall is an animagus herself, and this lesson is obvious foreshadowing to the theme of this year's entire story and the Marauders. But after she turned into a cat, she got nothing out of the students, and transformed back into a woman to tell them that typically she gets applause after that trick. Hermione then spoke up and told McGonagall that they just came from their first divination class, and McGonagall cut her off immediately, saying that she understood. Then, asking who was dying this year, Harry said he was. She told the students that Sybil Trelawney has been predicting the death of a student every year since she's been at Hogwarts, and no one has died yet. We can tell that McGonagall has little respect for divination and for her fellow teacher, but she tells the students that she tries not to speak ill of her coworkers. She then ends the class by telling Harry that if he dies, he need not hand in his homework, which gets a smile out of most of the students, and at that, they headed to lunch. Now, speaking of lunch, that brings us to the next change, as the movie removed that entire time between classes. This lunch isn't too important, but it does further reinforce the divide between Hermione and Ron regarding this Grim stuff. Ron is still scared, as he had a family member who died after seeing the Grim once, so he has first-hand experience with it. Hermione, on the other hand, is staunchly opposed to this new subject, and things kind of get heated between them, probably because they're already on edge due to Scabbers and Crookshanks. The conversation ends with Hermione saying that divination is a woolly subject with a lot of guesswork, and then she adds that it's nothing compared to her arithmancy class. Then she got up and left before Ron and Harry could ask her anything else. But Ron looked at Harry and said, "What's she talking about? She hasn't been to arithmancy class yet." And like I said earlier in today's video, they combined this moment with the breakfast scene in the book to get the transition scene we have here in the movie. Now that being said, we can head into the second half of their classes and take a look at Care of Magical Creatures. This is an iconic moment in the book as it introduces us to one of the most important characters in this year's story, Buckbeak. But the class has quite a few differences between the book and movie versions. To start, Hagrid brings out multiple hippogriffs, not just Buckbeak. Maybe this would have been too much CGI in the movie, and since none of the other hippogriffs have important roles in the plot, they just decided to cut it down to Buckbeak alone. Next, Harry actually volunteers himself in the book, not by accident. He actually puts himself forth to give it a try, simply because he didn't want Hagrid to have a bad first class. Just like in the movie, Draco was insulting to Hagrid, and Harry wanted everything to go as well as possible to prove Draco wrong. So Harry went up and willingly met Buckbeak, although he was scared. And just like in the movie, he got more than he bargained for when Hagrid told him that he could ride the beast. Which goes into our next change, albeit a small one, which is that Buckbeak only flew Harry in a circle around the paddock where the class was being held. He did not take Harry on an hour-long flight around the whole castle and across the lake. That would have taken way too long and would have been pretty dangerous for a first-time rider. The next change with the class is that after Harry landed with Buckbeak, the students took turns with the rest of the hippogriffs. They would go up and bow to them and then would pet them once the hippogriff bowed back. So in reality, the class went a bit better at first than the movie shows, as almost all the students got to have hands-on experience with the creatures. And that's the bonus of having multiple as well, instead of just one like in the movie. But now for Draco, this means that the way he gets injured is changed as well. He doesn't just walk up to Buckbeak and insult him randomly. He and his friends actually got grouped with Buckbeak, and he had properly bowed and been accepted by the animal. It's then as he's petting Buckbeak that he says, "Well, this is very easy. I bet you're not dangerous at all, you great ugly brute." And that is when Buckbeak attacked him. All of these changes together amount to an entirely different class than what we see on screen. However, I think the movie picked and pulled just enough of the right lines and moments out of the book to piece together a coherent class that didn't take as long for the film. Like I said, the only part that doesn't really make sense is this massive journey that Buckbeak takes Harry on. But anyway, we now come to the last change for this week, which is an omitted moment from the end of the chapter in the book in which Harry, Ron, and Hermione go to visit Hagrid after dinner. They go down to his hut and find him completely drunk inside. He is obviously upset because he thinks that he's going to get fired, and he feels like he let Dumbledore down. The trio try their best to comfort him, telling him that he didn't do anything wrong and it was all Draco's fault. But eventually, Hermione tells Hagrid that he's had enough to drink, and he agrees and goes outside to dunk his head in water. Then, after coming back inside with his hairy mane soaked, he seemingly comes to his senses and sobers up. He yells at Harry, realizing who it is, and tells him that he shouldn't be out of the castle this late. Then he turns to Ron and Hermione and yells at them for allowing Harry to go out, and Hagrid escorts them back up to the castle. And that's where the chapter, and our episode, ends for this week. And now that you're caught up on all of the changes between these scenes in the movie and their corresponding chapter in the book, what do you think? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. As always, be sure to like and subscribe if you enjoyed, and check out the series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.